Chapter 19.
"The children," Draka said at once. "The Red Walkers took them."
Durotan shook his head to clear it, fighting back the daze of revulsion.
"The Red Walkers needed to kill the wolves outright and swiftly," he said,
working it out as he spoke.
"That was the greatest threat, and the most meat. Orcs could be overcome, subdued, and made to walk under their own power. They took the wolves' meat and hides, and they took..."
For some strange reason, Durotan's mind seized on a careless comment he had made years ago, when they had first seen Gul'dan. He had said that Gaia looked like she wanted to make a feast out of the warlock. And Orgrim's words before they left, "Or mayhap they will run across Red Walkers who will do the job more swiftly than hunger." He thought of the times when some hunting parties had simply never returned, and his stomach clenched. "If you can't say it, you give them power," Durotan told himself. His fists clenched hard, bruising the palm that clutched Sever. Name the thing you fear, and you become its master.
"They took Nokra's flesh as well,"
he said. His voice was steady.
"The others, including the children, I believe they have taken prisoner. Food for later."
"Then," said Draka, speaking as bluntly as he had, "they are perhaps all still alive." Durotan and the others had been single-minded in their purpose when they set forth that morning. They had come to hunt down deserting clan members. Now that quest had turned into a rescue mission.
"The Red Walkers are not mounted, and we are," Durotan said. "We will find them, and when we do, they will die. Lok'tar!"
he shouted, and the others joined in. Their voices rang in the unnatural stillness. Doubtless the Red Walkers heard them. Durotan did not care. Let them know what awaited them. Let them know the Frostwolves were coming. The scent of their packmates' lifeblood filled the nostrils of the Frostwolves, and they ran with all that was in them. Their riders hung on tightly, giving the magnificent huge white beasts their heads. They ran swiftly but steadily, as they did when in pursuit of a herd. But Durotan could feel Sharptooth's tension. This was a very different sort of hunt, and both wolf and orc knew it. It was Gerlach who spotted the stream of smoke curling upwards, so thin that Durotan had to look carefully to see it. His stomach lurched as the wind shifted. It carried the smell of cooking flesh. It might have been appetizing if Durotan had not known what it was. Like his father before him, Durotan prided himself on being an orc of reason, not just battle prowess. Seldom had he felt the red haze of bloodlust, but it descended upon him now in full force. He had not realized that he had shouted a battle cry until his throat was raw, or that the sound in his ears was his own voice. The others picked up the cry. Their mounts, sensing their riders' desire, lowered their heads and ran as swiftly as they could. The hunting party was made of 5 orcs. The tracks of the Red Walkers indicated that there were 12. The Frostwolves didn't even slow down. They burst out of the trees and into an open area, the encampment before them nothing more than a stopping point in the snow. The haze of bloodlust lifted long enough for Durotan to note the camp's layout. A central fire pit, with several spits of meat part roasted, a pile of still bloody wolf pelts, a bulging sack leaking pools of red and reddish-black, and, bound together like so many pieces of kindling, the missing, living Frostwolves. The Red Walkers who had slain Garad had been horrifying enough. They had dipped their hands in animal blood and marked their bodies and faces with it. But the ones who turned to face the Frostwolves now looked like animals themselves. No, not animals, Durotan amended. Animals were natural creatures. What stood before him looked like the embodiment of nightmares. They did not have merely a few handprints of dried blood on their bodies. They wore the blood like clothing. Layer upon layer had crusted on their chests, arms, and legs. It was impossible to guess what color the blood had been when it had first been spilled, or how long it had been on their bodies. The new flies of spring clustered on the things that had once been recognizable as orcs, as they charged the mounted Frostwolves with a crazed recklessness. One, a female with long matted hair and wild eyes, raced towards Durotan with her spear. The blade was still coated with red wolf blood. Durotan leaped off Sharptooth. The wolf knew this maneuver and veered left when Durotan turned his attention to his attacker. Sharptooth bounded forward, springing on a second Red Walker who was swinging a mace at Melak. The wolf's jaws yawned wide, his teeth as white as his coat, and then clamped down on the orc's neck. The Red Walker went down at once in a flurry of snow, ash, embers, and a fountain of his own red-black blood. Draka stayed mounted as her wolf ran in a tight circle. Her hand was a blur as she knocked and released arrow after arrow. One of the Red Walkers, snatching up a piece of flaming wood from the fire, dived for Draka's mount. Durotan could smell burning fur, and Ice howled in pain. But the Red Walker went down with 2 arrows through his throat. Durotan was glad he had selected Sever and not Thunderstrike. He would not have wanted to dispatch these creatures from Sharptooth's back. He wanted to thrust his snarling face within inches of theirs, smell the caked, rotting blood, and watch the light of life in their eyes wink out as he split their chests open or sliced off their heads. He had never hated before, but he hated these orcs. He fell into his trance-like focus, losing track of time as his blade found flesh or blocked a strike, ceasing to count the number of times he ended a Red Walker's life so that he or she would never, ever do to another orc what they had done to a Frostwolf. Finally, his body wet with sweat and blood, some of which was his own, Durotan slowed, blinking, to behold the area littered with corpses. Most of them were the hideous fly-covered ones of the Red Walkers, but he saw Draka kneeling over the still body of Gul'dan. "He fell under 3, she said simply. "He took them all with him." Durotan realized he was panting and simply nodded. Gul'dan, who loved to sing the Loch Vatnods, would have been pleased to think he had earned a glorious one of his own. Melak and Krugla were in the process of sawing at the ropes that bound the remaining Frostwolves. It took Durotan another moment to come back to himself, and he realized with an icy jolt that the prisoners were all adults. "The children!" he shouted. He strode over to the rescued prisoners, treading without caring upon the corpses of the Red Walkers. They were not orcs. They were insane, twisted monsters, and they earned even less respect in death than they had commanded in life. "What happened? Where are they?" He grabbed Grukak by the front of his tunic. "They fled," Grukak said. His voice was close to a sob. He and all of the former prisoners wore desperate, stunned expressions, but Durotan had no time for sympathy. "When we were attacked, they bolted and fled into the trees." "Some of the Red Walkers went after them," Kagra said, "but they returned empty-handed. The children must have escaped." "When was this?" Durotan demanded. He remained furious with them. Gerlach and Nokra were dead because of the ill-advised decision to slink away in the night, and the thought of the children. "Half a day ago," Grukak said. His voice was somber. He knew what that meant. There were dangers in the woods for 3 children, 2 of whom were quite young. Wild wolves seldom attacked adult orcs, but would view such small ones as prey. Insects, whose bites were lethal, had emerged with the spring. Venomous snakes would still be too sluggish to slither away at a child's approach, choosing to strike instead. And night was coming. "Hurry," Durotan ordered. "We will search as best we can." He hoped that the spirits would guide them to the no doubt terrified youngsters. But the spirits were not kind. 6 fruitless hours later, in the middle of a dark and bitter night, the party was forced to abandon the hunt. It would be foolish to continue. The Red Walkers had taken most of the clothing from the frost wolves they had captured, and had not bothered to feed them or give them water. They were in bad shape. The darkness was so deep that the children could be lying unconscious a few feet away, and the adults would walk right past them. Quietly, Kagra began to weep. Draka put an arm around her. Durotan had to force himself not to rage at Kagra and the others. He knew they were suffering enough.
"Frostwolf children are strong and smart," Draka said confidently. "They have Shaxa with them. She is the same age I was when I was exiled, and I survived. We will return on the morrow with the whole clan to search for them."
She looked at Durotan.
"Won't we, my heart?"
"We will," Durotan promised. He didn't trust himself to say anything further. The ride back was cold, long, and silent. Durotan could not recall his heart ever being so heavy, not even when Garad had been slain before his eyes. Draka rode by his side while Durotan brooded, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. Except he couldn't. This was not an orc clan. This was a hive of madness. He was fiercely glad for a moment that his father was dead and could not bear witness to a depravity Durotan had never even conceived of. What in the name of the spirits were these Red Walkers? Could they even truly be called orcs any longer? For an orc to kill another was not unusual. Disrespect for the body was rarer, but it happened on occasion. But to feed upon it...
Durotan!
The voice belonged to Orgrim, and snapped Durotan out of his dark reverie. His second-in-command had ridden out to meet them.
You found them?
Not all, Durotan said heavily. We lost Nokra and Gurlak, and the children had already fled before we arrived. Orgrim's face fell at the mention of Nokra and Gurlak, but brightened inexplicably at the mention of the children.
Yes,
Orgrim said.
They did.
Mama! Came a shriek of delight.
Niska? Shaxa? Kelgor?
Durotan stared in astonishment as wolves bearing the 3 missing children raced from the encampment. The 2 littlest ones launched themselves at their mother, leaping with the fearless trust of the young straight from the backs of their wolves to be caught in a loving embrace. Shaxa vaulted from her wolf and ran to Kagra. Durotan felt a stab of sorrow as the girl asked, "But where is Papa?" and saw Kagra's face crumple. Gaia stood at the edge of the firelight, awaiting them. "I am so pleased you have returned, my son," she said. "I have not been sure how to handle our visitors." Durotan was utterly confused. Visitors? Why would she call returned children visitors? "There is nothing in the law about this situation," Gaia continued. "Drektar says they were sent by the spirits, and considering they have returned our children to us, I have made them welcome." Durotan had thought he had received more than enough shocks today, but it seemed there was a final one in store for him as he looked past his mother to the 3 shapes she indicated. They rose on legs that curved backwards like those of a tulbuk, standing taller than even the tallest orc. The firelight caught the gleam of horns and illuminated their blue faces and their glowing, sky-colored eyes. Those faces wore shy, happy smiles.
Draenor,
Durotan breathed.